She took a job cooking for cowboys on a ranch, not knowing one of them secretly owned the land they stood on. In the wide, unforgiving silence of the Wyoming Territory, October 1879, a young woman named Clara Dawson stepped off a dusty stagecoach. The wind cut through her thin coat like a knife, but she held her chin high, her eyes fixed on the worn gates of Dusty Creek Ranch. This was it. A new start. A place to disappear. She'd taken a job cooking for a crew of cowboys, figuring it was nothing more than hard work and long days. A way to earn her keep and stay hidden in a land that didn't ask questions. Every meal she cooked would keep these men in the saddle. Every biscuit she baked would fuel their fight to hold on to their small piece of the frontier. But Clara didn't know the truth about Dusty Creek. She didn't know the dust held secrets and the wind whispered warnings. She didn't know that among the rough and tumble cowboys was a man who was not what he seemed. A man whose quiet gaze held the weight of the entire valley. She thought he was just another rider, but she would soon learn that the land itself answered to him. Before the first hint of dawn painted the Wyoming sky, Clara was already moving in the shadows of the ranch kitchen. The fire crackled to life, the only sound in the bone-deep chill of the morning. Soon, the smell of biscuits, bacon, and strong coffee filled the air, a welcome shield against the cold for the men who would soon stumble in, their faces etched with weariness. The cowboys were a loud, boisterous bunch. Their laughter echoed off the timber beams as they shoveled food onto their plates, their calloused hands slapping the long wooden table. Clara kept her head down, a ghost in her own kitchen. She moved with a practiced silent rhythm, ladling stew, slicing bread, and pouring coffee without a word. She had learned long ago that survival meant being invisible, but her eyes missed nothing. At the far end of the table, sitting apart from the others, was Ethan. Tall, broad-shouldered, his hat tilted low over his face. His voice was a rare thing, never rising above a quiet murmur. He never joined the rowdy storytelling, never shoved his way in for a second helping. And he never looked at Clara with the hungry, lingering grins some of the other men offered. When his eyes did meet hers, they held something else entirely. A quiet respect. A strange, unsettling understanding, as if he saw past the apron and the tired lines on her face. As if he knew she was running from something. While the others joked and boasted, Ethan remained a statue, his fork moving slowly, his gaze lost somewhere out on the endless plains. Clara couldn't help but wonder what kind of man could ride all day and still carry such a heavy silence. Sometimes after supper, she'd see him staring at the horizon, not like a man admiring the sunset, but like a man waiting for an enemy to appear. She felt a pull toward him, a dangerous curiosity she couldn't explain. She knew cowboys. They were men of loud boasts and quick tempers. But Ethan didn't fit. He wore the same dust-stained boots, the same trail-worn clothes, but he was a phantom among them. At night, in her small room off the kitchen, the memory of his gaze would return to her. It wasn't hunger she saw in his eyes. It was weight, the weight of a secret. She told herself it was foolish. Men like him were trouble, their secrets carved so deep they could break a woman without even trying. Yet the feeling persisted, a constant whisper in the back of her mind. Ethan was not who he appeared to be. And every morning, when she saw him sitting alone, an island of calm in a sea of noise, she knew her instincts were right. Something was wrong at Dusty Creek Ranch, and the silent cowboy at the end of the table was at the very heart of it. The orange glow of sunset was bleeding across the sky when Clara heard the voices. She was carrying a basket of fresh bread through the barn, and the words that reached her were sharp with tension, slicing through the quiet evening air. She froze behind a stack of hay bales, her hands gripping the wicker handle. It was the ranch foreman, Jed, his voice tight with a fear he couldn't hide. He was arguing with two men in pressed coats and polished boots, men who looked like vultures who had wandered far from the city. They spoke of deeds and signatures, of powerful buyers waiting in town. They were talking about selling the ranch, piece by piece, to strangers who wouldn't know a branding iron from a snake. Jed pleaded with them, his voice cracking under the weight of debts he clearly couldn't pay. But the city men were relentless. Time was running out, they warned. The ranch would be theirs, one way or another. Clara felt a knot of ice form in her stomach. This place, this fragile refuge she had found, was built on a foundation of sand, and the tide was coming in. She slipped away before they could see her, her heart hammering against her ribs. But at supper that night, something was different. The Cowboys were quiet, muttering curses into their plates. The threat of losing their home hung over the room like a shroud. All of them felt it. Except for one. Ethan sat in his usual spot, calm as a windless night. He ate his stew in silence, his eyes steady, as if he were merely watching the predictable end of a game he'd seen played 100 times before. His stillness was more unsettling than the foreman's panic. There wasn't a trace of worry on his face, only a quiet, unnerving certainty. Clara found herself staring, wondering how a simple cowboy, a man who spoke so little, could carry himself with such unspoken authority in the face of ruin. It didn't make sense. Later that night, lying in her narrow bed, the conversation from the barn played over and over in her mind. Jed's desperation, the stranger's cold confidence, but always her thoughts returned to Ethan. To the flicker of something in his eyes she couldn't name. It was more than just calm. It was control. She started to feel it then, a strange and impossible thought taking root in her mind. It felt as if the land itself answered to him. As if the soil beneath the ranch house, the creeks, the hills, as if it all recognized him in a way it recognized no one else. Fear and curiosity waged a war inside her. She knew that uncovering a man's secrets in the West was a dangerous game. But she couldn't shake the feeling that Ethan's secret was the only thing that could save them all. The tension on the ranch grew thicker with each passing day. The men whispered in corners, their eyes full of doubt. But Ethan remained an anchor in the storm, his silence a strange source of strength. And Clara felt the pull, an invisible thread connecting her to him, to a truth that was about to change everything. She just prayed she would survive its unveiling. 1 week later, the truth arrived with the thunder of hooves. It was well past midnight when a dozen riders stormed into the ranch yard, their lanterns casting wild, dancing shadows. Their voices were sharp with threats, promising to burn the place to the ground if they didn't get what they wanted. Clara watched from the kitchen doorway, her hand over her mouth, as the Cowboys stumbled from the bunkhouse, their faces a mixture of confusion and terror. The foreman, Jed, tried to reason with them, but his words were swallowed by their cruel laughter. These were the speculators from the barn, and they had brought an army of hired guns with them. They were done negotiating. They were taking the ranch tonight. Clara's heart hammered against her ribs. This was it, the end of the line. But then, something shifted. From the corner of the cookhouse, where he'd been sitting by the dying embers of the fire, Ethan rose to his feet. He moved with a slow, deliberate grace, the firelight catching the hard lines of his face. His calm was absolute, a chilling counterpoint to the chaos outside. He stepped onto the porch, his boots making a solid, heavy sound on the wooden planks. The air itself seemed to grow still. For the first time, Clara saw him not as a quiet cowboy, but as something else, something powerful. The leader of the hired guns sneered at him. "Get out of the way, farmhand! This doesn't concern you!" But Ethan's voice, when it came, cut through the night like a razor. It was low, steady, and filled with an authority that silenced every man there. "Everything on this land concerns me," he said, "because it's mine." A stunned silence fell over the yard. The intruders exchanged confused glances. The Cowboys stared, their mouths agape. "This ranch," Ethan continued, his voice ringing with power, "is Dusty Creek Ranch, but my family has another name for it, the Montgomery place. And I am Ethan Montgomery. This land has been in my blood for 3 generations. The hired guns laughed, but the sound was hollow now, uncertain. You're no owner, their leader spat. You're just a hired hand. I've been working shoulder to shoulder with these men, Ethan said, his eyes sweeping over the Cowboys, because I needed to know who was loyal. I needed to see who would stand and fight when the vultures came circling, and who would run. Gasps rippled through the Cowboys, a look of dawning understanding, of awe, spread across their faces. And in the kitchen doorway, Clara's breath caught in her throat. The truth hit her with the force of a physical blow. She had been serving meals to the man who owned it all. The quiet cowboy, the silent observer, was the master of this entire valley. Every unspoken glance, every moment of quiet strength, it all clicked into place. This wasn't just a job. She was standing in the middle of a war for a hidden king's throne. The hired guns began to back away, their bravado crumbling in the face of this impossible revelation. The ranch hands, who seconds before had been terrified, now stood taller, their hands moving toward their own guns, their eyes fixed on the man they now knew was their true leader. Clara felt the world tilt on its axis. Her simple life was gone, replaced by a reality far more dangerous and complex than she could have ever imagined. Ethan's gaze found hers across the yard. It was steady, unyielding, and in it, she saw a promise. The fight wasn't over. It had just begun, and she was standing right in the middle of it. As the last of the intruders' hoofbeats faded into the Wyoming darkness, a heavy silence descended upon Dusty Creek Ranch. The Cowboys stood in stunned silence, looking from the empty road to the man on the porch. Their quiet, unassuming bunkmate was the owner of everything they could see. Clara remained frozen in the kitchen doorway, her mind reeling. Ethan Montgomery. The name felt foreign, powerful. It didn't fit the quiet man she thought she knew. He turned then, his eyes finding hers in the dim light. The hard mask of authority he had worn just moments before seemed to soften, replaced by something she had never seen on his face: vulnerability. He walked toward her, his steps slow and deliberate. He stopped just a few feet away, his gaze searching hers. "I'm sorry I deceived you, Clara," he said, his voice low. "It was the only way." He didn't just thank her for her courage or for the meals she cooked. He thanked her for her kindness, for the quiet strength she showed every single day, even when she was clearly carrying burdens of her own. His words wrapped around her like a warm blanket against the cold. She realized her time here was never just about survival. It was about connection. About unknowingly finding a home in the heart of a man who was fighting his own silent war. She saw the truth then. He hadn't just been testing his men. He had been testing her, too. And for some reason, she had passed. But as the adrenaline faded, a new, cold fear began to creep in. The men who had come tonight were not the type to give up easily. They were merely the foot soldiers. The real power, the man who had sent them, was still out there, hidden in the shadows. Now he knew Ethan's true identity, and he knew that the quiet ranch cook was standing by his side. They had won the battle, but in doing so, they had declared war on a far more dangerous enemy. An enemy who now knew both their names. The days that followed the failed raid were thick with an unspoken tension. Ethan, or Mr. Montgomery, as the men awkwardly started to call him, organized the Cowboys into a makeshift militia. Watches were set, rifles were cleaned. The ranch was no longer a home, it was a fortress, and Clara was its most vulnerable resident. One evening, as she was kneading dough in the kitchen, Ethan entered, his face grim. He closed the door behind him, a sign that this was not a casual conversation. "They'll be back, Clara," he said, his voice low. "And they won't just bring hired guns next time. The man behind this is named Silas Blackwood. He's a railroad baron, and he believes there's gold on this land. My father refused to sell, so Blackwood ruined him financially, then had him removed. The word hung in the air, cold and sharp. Murdered. Ethan's fight wasn't just for land, it was for vengeance. He thinks this is just an empty valley, Ethan continued. He doesn't know my father left me the true deed, hidden away. But he also doesn't know about the other thing my father left. He paused, his eyes locking onto hers. There's a clause in the original land grant. A provision that says, if the land is ever found to contain significant mineral wealth, the ownership reverts to the federal government, unless the original family proves they discovered it first and filed a claim. Blackwood doesn't just want the land. He wants to erase my family's history so he can claim the gold for himself. A chill went down Clara's spine. This was so much bigger than a simple land dispute. It was a conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of power. Why are you telling me this? She whispered, her hands still covered in flour. Because Blackwood is thorough, Ethan said, his jaw tight. He'll investigate everyone on this ranch. He'll find out who you are. And when he does, he'll realize you're not just a cook. He took a step closer. You're Clara Dawson, daughter of Judge Elias Dawson, the one man in this territory who publicly opposed Blackwood's railroad expansion, right before he was found dead in a hotel fire. The flour canister slipped from Clara's hands, crashing to the floor in a white cloud. Her secret was out. The past she had run so far to escape had finally caught up with her. She wasn't just a witness to Ethan's war. She was a part of it. Her father hadn't died in an accident. He had been silenced by the same man who was now trying to steal this land. And now, Silas Blackwood knew that the daughter of his old enemy was hiding in plain sight, on the very land he was trying to conquer. She wasn't just in danger. She was a target. Clara's carefully constructed world shattered. She had fled to Wyoming after her father's death, changing her name, taking the most menial job she could find, all to become invisible. She had believed the official story, a tragic accident, a stray ember from a cigar. But deep down she had always known it was a lie. Her father had been too careful, too meticulous, and he had been making powerful enemies. Now, standing in the dusty kitchen of Dusty Creek Ranch, the terrible truth was staring her in the face. Her father had been murdered, and Ethan knew. How? She breathed, the single word a pained whisper. I've been investigating Blackwood for 2 years, Ethan replied, his voice gentle but firm. I've followed his trail of corruption across 3 territories. When I learned your real name, I put the pieces together. Your father was trying to expose him. He was killed for it. And I'm willing to bet Blackwood doesn't know you survived the fire that was meant to destroy all the evidence, including you. The room spun. The fire. She had been staying with an aunt that night. It was the only reason she was still alive. She had thought it was a miracle. Now she knew it was just a loose end Blackwood had failed to tie up. He thinks you're dead, Clara, Ethan said, his voice urgent. But if he starts digging into the people on this ranch, he'll find you. And he will not make the same mistake twice. The fear that had been her constant companion for months now returned with a vengeance, colder and sharper than ever. But this time, it was mixed with something else. Rage. A burning righteous anger for the father she had lost, for the life that had been stolen from her. What do we do? She asked, her voice shaking but her eyes finding a new hard resolve. My father hid the original deed in his geological surveys, the proof of the gold, somewhere on this ranch, Ethan explained. I've been searching for them since I got here. I believe they're in a hidden safe in his old study. But the foreman, Jed, sealed that part of the house off after my father's death, said it was out of respect. Now I know he was likely paid off by Blackwood to make sure no one ever found it. Another piece of the puzzle clicked into place. Jed wasn't just a desperate man in debt. He was a traitor, a fox guarding the henhouse. We need to get into that study, Ethan said. Tonight, we need that proof before Blackwood makes his next move. Suddenly, Clara was no longer just a cook. She was a co-conspirator. The fate of the ranch and the chance for justice for her own father depended on what they found behind that sealed door. She looked at Ethan, at the grim determination in his eyes, and saw a reflection of her own burgeoning need for vengeance. "I'm with you," she said, her voice clear and strong. She was done running. She was done being invisible. Silas Blackwood had taken everything from her. Now, she was going to help take it all back. That night, under the sliver of a Wyoming moon, the ranch house was quiet. Too quiet. Ethan led Clara down a dusty, forgotten hallway at the back of the house. They moved like ghosts, their footsteps muffled by the thick layer of dust that covered the floorboards. At the end of the hall was a heavy oak door, crudely boarded over with thick planks of wood. "Jed told everyone there were termites, that the whole wing was unsafe," Ethan whispered, pulling a crowbar from his belt. "He was lying." The wood groaned in protest as Ethan worked the planks free. With a final sharp crack, the last board came loose. The air that escaped from the sealed room was stale, thick with the smell of old paper and decay. It was the smell of a tomb. Ethan pushed the door open, and they stepped inside. The room was just as his father had left it. A thick blanket of dust covered everything. A large mahogany desk, leather-bound books lining the walls, a world map with pins stuck in it. And on the far wall, half hidden behind a faded tapestry, was a large iron safe. "This is it," Ethan breathed. He ran his hands over the cold iron, his fingers tracing the combination dial. "My father taught me the combination when I was a boy. He said it was the key to our family's future." He began to turn the dial, the soft clicks echoing in the silent room. Clara held her breath, her heart pounding in her chest. Everything hinged on this moment. The proof of ownership. The evidence of the gold. The weapon they needed to bring down a monster. Click, click, clunk. The heavy handle turned, and the safe door swung open with a low groan. Ethan reached inside, his hands searching in the darkness. But when he pulled them out, they were empty. He frowned, reaching deeper, his arms disappearing up to his elbows. A moment later, he straightened up, a look of utter disbelief on his face. "It's empty," he said, his voice a hollow echo in the dusty room. "The deed, the surveys, the maps, everything, it's all gone." A cold dread washed over Clara. They were too late. Someone had been there before them. But who? Who else could have possibly known about the safe? Her eyes darted around the room, searching for an answer. And then she saw it. On the floor, half hidden beneath the desk, was something small and metallic. A cufflink. It was ornate, silver, with a distinctive J engraved on it. Jed. The foreman hadn't just sealed the room. He had looted it. He wasn't just a traitor. He was the key. He had the evidence. But before either of them could process this new revelation, a sound from outside shattered the silence. The sharp, unmistakable crack of a rifle shot, followed by a chorus of shouts. Lights flared to life in the ranch yard. They had been discovered. But it wasn't Blackwood's men. It was the Cowboys. And standing in the middle of them, pointing a trembling finger toward the forbidden wing of the house, was Jed. "They're in there!" he screamed, his voice filled with a feigned panic. "They broke into the master's private study! They're thieves!" It was a setup, a perfectly orchestrated trap. Jed hadn't just stolen the documents. He had used their attempt to find them as a way to turn the entire ranch against them. They weren't heroes trying to save their home. They were criminals, caught in the act, and they were trapped. Chaos erupted in the yard. The Cowboys, loyal but confused, raised their rifles, their trust in Ethan shattered by Jed's convincing performance. "Don't shoot!" Ethan yelled from the darkened window of the study. "Jed is the traitor! He's working for Blackwood!" But Jed was ready for that. "He's lying!" The foreman screamed, his voice cracking with false emotion. He's been filling your heads with stories. He's no Montgomery. He's a con man, here to steal the ranch out from under us. I have the real deed right here. He held up a piece of parchment from his pocket. It was a forgery, Clara knew, but in the flickering torchlight, it looked real enough. The men hesitated, their faces a battleground of confusion and suspicion. They had trusted Ethan. But Jed had been with them for years. He was one of them. Think about it, Jed shouted, pressing his advantage. He shows up out of nowhere, works for pennies, then suddenly claims to own the place. And now he's robbing the dead owner's study with this strange woman he brought here? It's a trick. The tide was turning. Clara could see it in their eyes. The seed of doubt Jed had planted was taking root. They were losing them. The cufflink, Ethan, Clara whispered urgently. Show them the cufflink. Ethan held it up to the window. I found this in here. It's Jed's. He was here before us. He's the one who stole the real documents. Jed's face went pale for a fraction of a second, a flicker of pure terror in his eyes before he covered it with a sneer. I lost that ages ago. He's trying to frame me. It was his word against theirs, and they were trapped in a dark room, looking like thieves. They had no way out. The hallway behind them led to a dead end. The window was a 30-foot drop. Jed had them perfectly cornered. There's a secret passage, Ethan muttered, his eyes scanning the bookshelf. My father built one. It leads to the cellars. If I can just find the trigger. He began pushing on books, his hands moving frantically. War and Peace, Moby Dick. Where is it? Outside, Jed was whipping the men into a frenzy. Don't let them get away. They're trying to steal our home. The first shot splintered the window frame, showering Clara with glass. They were out of time. It's a Bible. Clara suddenly remembered something her father, the judge, had once told her. Men of secrets always hide them behind faith or law. Ethan's hand found the worn leather spine of a large Bible. He pulled it. With a low groan, a section of the bookshelf swung inward, revealing a dark, narrow passage. Go, Ethan urged, pushing her toward the opening. I'll hold them off. But Clara shook her head. We go together. Another shot rang out, this one thudding into the wall just above her head. They scrambled into the passage, Ethan pulling the bookshelf closed behind them, just as the door to the study burst open. They were plunged into absolute darkness, the sound of their own ragged breaths echoing in the tight space. They could hear the muffled shouts of the Cowboys on the other side of the wall. They had escaped the room, but they were still trapped inside the house, hunted by the very men they were trying to save. And the only person who knew the truth was a traitor who now held all the cards. The secret passage was suffocatingly narrow, the air thick with the smell of dust and stone. They stumbled through the inky blackness, their hands scraping against the rough walls. The muffled shouts of the Cowboys grew fainter as they descended deeper into the guts of the house. Finally, their feet hit a dirt floor. The cellar. A faint sliver of moonlight from a high, grimy window gave them just enough light to see. The cellar was a maze of barrels and crates, but on the far side was a heavy wooden door that led outside. Freedom. They crept toward it, their hearts pounding with every creak of the floorboards above them. But as Ethan reached for the iron latch, a new voice cut through the silence. A voice that was not one of the Cowboys. I wouldn't do that if I were you, Mr. Montgomery. A figure stepped out from behind a stack of barrels, a lantern in one hand and a pistol in the other. It wasn't Jed. It wasn't one of Blackwood's hired guns. It was one of the ranch hands. A young, quiet cowboy named Billy, a boy who had always seemed too gentle for this life, who Clara had often given an extra biscuit to. Billy, Ethan said, his voice a mixture of shock and confusion. What are you doing? Billy offered a sad, apologetic smile. Jed's not the only one on Blackwood's payroll. He just pays better than you do. The betrayal was a punch to the gut. They hadn't just misjudged the foreman. They had been surrounded by spies. How many others were there? Was anyone on their side? Jed's a fool, Billy continued, his pistol held steady. He thinks Blackwood is going to make him a partner, but I know the truth. Blackwood doesn't make partners. He just makes corpses. Then why are you helping him? Clara asked, her voice trembling. Because he promised me something Jed could never offer, Billy said, his eyes hardening. A ticket out of this miserable territory, and a fat stack of cash to get me started. He gestured with his pistol. Now, Jed sent me to make sure you didn't get away. He wants you alive for now. Says Blackwood wants to have a chat. So you're going to march right back upstairs, nice and easy. This was it. The trap had closed. There was no escape. But as Billy took a step forward, his eyes flickered for a moment, darting toward a dark corner of the cellar. It was a tiny, almost imperceptible movement, but Clara saw it. It wasn't the look of a confident captor. It was the look of a man who was afraid. A man who was not alone. In that split second, she knew. Billy wasn't the hunter. He was the bait. Suddenly, a massive shape lunged out of the darkness behind Billy. One of the other cowboys, a giant of a man named Gus, wrapped his huge arms around the younger man, pinning his arms to his sides. Billy cried out in surprise, his pistol clattering to the dirt floor. I ain't on no one's payroll but the Montgomerys, Gus growled, his face a mask of grim loyalty. And I don't take kindly to rats in my house. Two other cowboys emerged from the shadows, their rifles leveled. They had seen through Jed's lies, or at least they had chosen to believe in Ethan. Relief washed over Clara, so potent it almost brought her to her knees. They weren't alone. But their small victory was short-lived. A loud whistle pierced the night from outside, followed by the sound of dozens of approaching horses. That'll be Blackwood's men, Gus said grimly. Jed must have signaled them. He didn't just turn the ranch against you. He sold us all out. The ranch was about to be overrun. Their small band of loyalists was hopelessly outnumbered. Where did Jed go? Ethan demanded, grabbing the stolen pistol from the floor. Billy, still struggling in Gus's grip, just spat on the ground. He took the documents and rode out to meet Blackwood. He's probably halfway to the railroad by now. It was a devastating blow. The evidence was gone. Even if they survived the night, they had no way to prove their claim. They had lost. But Clara's mind was racing. Jed, the cufflink, the forged deed. He was a meticulous man, a planner. But he was also arrogant, and he was a coward. He wouldn't ride out to meet Blackwood alone and unarmed. He would have a hiding place, a place he thought no one knew about. She thought back to all the meals she had served, the conversations she had overheard, the small details she had filed away. And then, it hit her. A memory of Jed, complaining about a leaky roof in the old abandoned line shack at the far edge of the property, the one by Whisper Creek. He had made a point of saying no one ever went out there. It was the perfect place to hide something, or to wait for a getaway. He didn't go to the railroad, she said, her voice filled with a sudden, electrifying certainty. He's at the old line shack by the creek. He's waiting there for Blackwood's men to clear us out, and then he'll hand over the papers. Ethan and Gus exchanged a look. It was a long shot, a desperate gamble based on nothing more than a woman's intuition. But it was the only shot they had. Gus, you and the others hold them off here for as long as you can, Ethan commanded, his mind already formulating a plan. Create a diversion. Make them think we're all holed up in the main house. He turned to Clara. You and I are going out the back. We're going to get our property back. The hunt was on, and this time, they weren't the prey. They slipped out of the cellar and into the chaos. The main yard was a storm of gunfire and shouting as Gus and the loyal cowboys made their stand, drawing the attention of Blackwood's invading force. Under the cover of darkness and confusion, Ethan and Clara crept along the shadows of the outbuildings, making their way to the stables. Horses were their only chance. Every shadow seemed to hold an enemy. Every gust of wind sounded like a footstep. The air was thick with the smell of gunpowder. They reached the stables, their lungs burning. The horses were skittish, their eyes wide with fear from the noise. Ethan quickly saddled two of them, his hands moving with an efficiency that spoke of a lifetime in the saddle. "The line shack is a 5-mile ride," he whispered, helping Clara mount her horse. "We have to ride hard and fast. If Jed meets up with Blackwood's main force before we get there, it's over." As they spurred their horses out of the stable and into the open rangeland, a lone rider saw them. He raised his rifle, a muzzle flash splitting the darkness. The bullet whizzed past Clara's ear, so close she felt its heat. She dug her heels into her horse's flanks, leaning low over its neck as they galloped into the night. They were exposed now. Hunted. Behind them, the sounds of the battle at the ranch began to fade, replaced by the pounding of their horses' hooves and the frantic thumping of her own heart. The Wyoming landscape, so beautiful by day, was a treacherous maze of shadows and unseen obstacles by night. They rode recklessly, trusting their horses to find their footing. After what felt like an eternity, a faint light appeared in the distance. A single lantern, glowing in the window of a dilapidated shack. Jed's hideout. They slowed their horses, dismounting 100 yards away and creeping forward on foot. The shack was small, barely more than a single room. Through the grimy window they could see him. Jed was sitting at a small table, a bottle of whiskey in one hand and a stack of papers in the other. Their papers. The deed. The surveys. He was alone. Ethan drew his pistol. "I'll go in the front," he whispered. "You circle around to the back. If he tries to run, don't let him get past you." Clara nodded, her own fear a cold knot in her stomach. She crept around the side of the shack, her hand resting on the small derringer she kept hidden in her boot, a relic from the father she was now trying to avenge. As she reached the back of the shack, she heard Ethan's voice, low and deadly. "It's over, Jed." She peeked around the corner just in time to see Jed leap to his feet, knocking over the table. He wasn't reaching for a gun. He was grabbing the lantern. With a desperate snarl, he hurled it at the far wall. The glass shattered, and flames instantly erupted, licking up the dry, ancient wood. The shack was a tinderbox. "If I can't have this ranch, no one will," Jed screamed, a wild, crazed look in his eyes. He lunged for the scattered papers on the floor, the precious evidence now just inches from the spreading fire. Clara didn't hesitate. She burst through the back door as Ethan dove for Jed. The two men crashed to the floor, locked in a desperate struggle. Clara ignored them. Her only focus was the papers. She scrambled on her hands and knees, snatching them up just as the flames reached the spot where they had been. The heat was intense, the smoke thick and choking. She clutched the documents to her chest and backed away toward the door. Ethan had Jed pinned to the floor, his fist raised. "It's not worth it, Ethan!" Clara screamed over the roar of the fire. "We have what we came for! We have to go!" For a second, she saw a murderous rage in Ethan's eyes, the look of a man about to deliver a final, fatal justice. But then his gaze met hers, and the rage subsided, replaced by reason. He landed one last brutal punch that left Jed unconscious, then scrambled to his feet. He grabbed Clara's hand, and they ran from the burning shack, leaving the traitor to his fate. They stumbled out into the cool night air, gasping for breath, the precious documents clutched safely in Clara's hands. They had done it. They had the proof. But as they looked back toward the main ranch, a horrifying sight met their eyes. The glow of the burning shack was now joined by a second, much larger glow. Blackwood's men weren't just attacking the ranch. They were burning it to the ground. The ride back was a desperate, frantic race against time. The fire at the main house grew larger with every passing second, a monstrous orange beacon in the night sky. They weren't just riding to save a building. They were riding to save their friends. As they crested the final ridge overlooking the valley, the full horror of the scene unfolded below them. The bunkhouse was engulfed in flames. Blackwood's men were everywhere, systematically setting fire to every structure, their silhouettes like demons against the inferno. But Gus and the others were still fighting. They had retreated to the stone-walled cookhouse, Clara's kitchen, and were laying down a surprisingly effective field of fire. It was the most defensible position on the ranch, and they were using it to their advantage. But they were pinned down, surrounded. It was only a matter of time before they were overrun or burned alive. "There's a dry creek bed that runs along the north pasture," Ethan shouted over the roar of the flames. "It'll get us close to the cookhouse without being seen. We have to get those men out of there." They guided their horses down the treacherous slope and into the creek bed. The gully provided perfect cover, shielding them from view. They dismounted near the back of the cookhouse and crept the last 50 yards on foot. The heat was blistering, the air thick with smoke that stung their eyes and clawed at their throats. Ethan put his mouth close to Clara's ear. "I'm going to draw their fire. When I do, you get to that back door and get it open. Tell Gus they need to make a run for the creek bed. Go!" Before she could protest, he was gone, disappearing into the smoke. A moment later, a series of shots rang out from the far side of the barn, followed by shouts from Blackwood's men. The diversion. It was working. The men surrounding the cookhouse turned their attention, their fire, toward the new threat. Clara took a deep breath and ran. She sprinted across the exposed ground, the heat of the burning bunkhouse scorching her skin. She reached the back door of the kitchen, her hands fumbling with the latch. It was barred from the inside. "Gus!" she screamed, pounding on the heavy wood. "It's Clara! Open the door!" For a terrifying second, there was no response. Then she heard the heavy bar being lifted, and the door swung open. Gus pulled her inside, his face covered in soot, his eyes wide with a mixture of shock and relief. "We thought you were dead!" he yelled over the crackle of the fire and the constant barrage of gunfire against the stone walls. "Ethan's created a diversion!" she yelled back. "We have to make a run for the creek bed. It's our only way out." Gus nodded grimly, turning to the handful of surviving cowboys. "You heard the lady. Grab what ammo you can. We're leaving." As the men prepared for their desperate escape, Clara's eyes scanned the kitchen that had been her home. And then she saw him. Billy, the young traitor. He was tied to a chair in the corner, a gag in his mouth, his eyes wide with terror as he watched the flames lit closer to the windows. Gus had captured him, but in the chaos, they had forgotten him. A part of her, a cold, hard part, said to leave him. He had betrayed them. He deserved this. But then she looked into his terrified, boyish eyes, and she saw not a monster, but a scared kid who had made a terrible mistake. "We can't just leave him!" she shouted to Gus. The big cowboy looked from Billy to the encroaching flames and just shrugged. "He ain't my priority." But Clara couldn't do it. While Gus organized the men at the door, she ran to Billy and sawed at his ropes with a kitchen knife. The moment he was free, he scrambled away from her, cowering in the corner. He was paralyzed by fear. Just then, a burning beam from the roof crashed to the floor, sending a shower of sparks into the room. The exit was about to be cut off. "Let's go!" Gus yelled. There was no more time. Clara grabbed the petrified boy by the arm and dragged him toward the door. They were the last ones out, plunging back into the fiery chaos of the yard just as the kitchen roof collapsed behind them. They ran, a small, desperate band of survivors, toward the safety of the creek bed, with the sounds of their home dying behind them. They tumbled into the dry creek bed, gasping for air, their lungs raw from the smoke. For a moment they were safe. Ethan was already there, his face grim as he watched the last of his family's legacy turn to ash. Gus and the 3 other surviving cowboys collapsed onto the ground, exhausted and defeated. Billy, the young traitor Clara had saved, was sobbing quietly, curled into a ball. They had survived, but they had lost everything. The ranch was gone. What do we do now, boss? Gus asked, his voice heavy with despair. All eyes turned to Ethan. He stood for a long moment, staring at the inferno that had once been his home. The fire reflected in his eyes, but behind the flames, there was a core of pure, unquenchable steel. A ranch is more than just wood and nails, Gus, he said, his voice quiet but firm. It's the land, and as long as we're standing on it, it's ours. He turned his gaze to Clara, who was clutching the precious documents to her chest. And we have the proof. His eyes then fell on the weeping boy, Billy. He walked over and stood before him. Billy flinched, expecting a blow, or worse. But Ethan just knelt down, his expression unreadable. You sold us out for a ticket out of this territory, Ethan said, his voice devoid of anger. This land is all I have. It's all these men have. You tried to take that from us. He paused. But you're just a boy, and you made a mistake. Silas Blackwood is the real enemy. He uses people like you, then throws them away. He offered his hand to the boy. You have a choice. You can run, and he will hunt you down. Or you can stand with us. You can fight for something real, and you can earn your way back. Slowly, hesitantly, Billy looked up. He saw no condemnation in Ethan's eyes, only a hard-won strength. He took the offered hand and allowed Ethan to pull him to his feet. In that moment, a traitor was redeemed, and their small, broken band found a new, shared purpose. But their moment of unity was cut short by a new sound. Hoofbeats. A single rider, approaching fast. Not from the direction of the fire, but from the east. From the direction of town. They all drew their weapons, taking cover behind the banks of the creek bed. A lone figure emerged from the darkness, riding hard. As he got closer, they could see he wasn't one of Blackwood's men. It was the town sheriff, a man named Miller, a man known to be firmly in Blackwood's pocket. Had he come to finish the job? The sheriff reined in his horse at the edge of the creek, holding his hands up to show they were empty. Montgomery! He yelled, his voice ragged. I need to talk to you. You're a little late for a conversation, Sheriff, Ethan yelled back. Your boss seems to prefer fire. That's why I'm here, Miller shouted, his voice desperate. Blackwood has gone too far. Bribery is one thing, but this is a massacre. He's brought in a private army of hired killers. They've taken over the town. My deputies are locked up or dead. He's declared martial law. The news was a staggering blow. Blackwood wasn't just trying to take a ranch, he was staging a coup. He was seizing control of the entire county. He's at the old silver mine up in the hills, the sheriff continued. He's got a dozen men with him, and he has a hostage. He paused, his next word sending a fresh wave of ice through Clara's veins. Jed, the fool tried to double-cross him, demanded more money. So Blackwood decided to make an example of him. Blackwood wasn't just a criminal. He was a megalomaniac, a man who believed he was above all law. And now, he had dug himself in, surrounded by killers, ready to slaughter anyone who stood in his way. They were no longer just fighting for a piece of paper. They were fighting for the soul of the entire territory. And their army consisted of one determined landowner, one brave woman, 4 weary cowboys, one terrified redeemed boy, and one turncoat sheriff. The odds weren't just long, they were impossible. The first light of dawn was breaking, casting a gray, ghostly pallor over the smoldering ruins of the ranch. The small band of survivors huddled in the creek bed, the impossible weight of their task settling over them. Attacking a fortified mine held by a dozen trained killers was suicide. We can't fight them head on, Gus said, stating the obvious. They'll cut us to pieces before we get within 100 yards. Sheriff Miller nodded in agreement. The main entrance is a death trap. There's only one way in and out. That's not true, Ethan said suddenly, a strange light in his eyes. He was looking at the geological survey maps they had rescued from the fire, spread out on the ground before them. My father was a brilliant engineer. He was always worried about cave-ins, According to this map, he designed a series of ventilation shafts. They're too small for a man to climb down, but his eyes flickered to the top of the map. There's one main air shaft here, at the summit of the mountain. It connects to the deepest part of the mine, right below Blackwood's main office. A desperate plan began to form. The shaft will be covered by a grate, Ethan continued, thinking aloud. But it's our only chance. Miller, you and Gus will take the others and create a diversion at the main entrance. Make as much noise as you can. Draw their attention. Make them think it's a full frontal assault. He turned to Clara. You and I, he said, his voice low and intense, are going up the mountain. It was a crazy, reckless plan. They would have to climb the sheer back face of the mountain in broad daylight, find the shaft, and somehow lower themselves into the heart of the enemy's lair. What about me? A small voice asked. It was Billy. His face was pale with fear, but his eyes held a new determination. I know those mines. My pa used to work them before Blackwood took over. I can guide you up the back trail, the one the prospectors used to use. It's dangerous, but it's the fastest way. Ethan studied the boy for a long moment, then nodded. All right, son. You're with us. The group split up. Gus, the sheriff, and the remaining cowboys rode off toward the front of the mine, their faces set with grim resolve. Ethan, Clara, and their young guide began the arduous climb up the back of the mountain. The trail was barely there, a treacherous path of loose rock and scree. They climbed for hours, the sun beating down on them, their muscles screaming in protest. Finally, they reached the summit. And there it was. A large iron grate, half overgrown with weeds, covering a dark, circular hole that plunged into the earth. The air shaft. Ethan and Billy worked together, using a rifle butt to pry the heavy grate open. They peered down into the darkness. A faint, foul-smelling breeze drifted up from the depths. It was at least 100-foot drop. Now what? Clara asked, her voice barely a whisper. Ethan uncoiled a long rope he had been carrying over his shoulder. Now, he said, securing it to the base of a sturdy pine tree. We go fishing. He looked at Clara, his eyes full of a fierce, protective light. Stay here. When you hear the shooting stop, bring the documents and ride for the U.S. Marshal's office in Cheyenne. If we're not out in an hour, don't wait for us. Just go. The most important thing is that the truth gets out. He was telling her to save herself, to abandon them if the plan went wrong. But Clara shook her head. I'm not leaving you, she said, her hand finding his. My father died because he fought Blackwood alone. We finish this together. Before Ethan could argue, Billy spoke up. He's right, the boy said, nodding toward Ethan. You're the witness. You have to survive. He then turned to Ethan, his young face suddenly aged with a solemn courage. I'll go down first. Test the rope. Make sure it holds. It was an act of pure, selfless bravery. The boy who had betrayed them was now willing to risk his life for them. Ethan looked from the boy's determined face to Clara's resolute one. He saw the same fire in both of them. He finally nodded, a flicker of pride in his eyes. All right, he said. Let's go finish this. He checked the rope one last time, then disappeared over the edge, rappelling down into the darkness. Billy followed a moment later. Then it was Clara's turn. She took one last look at the sky, clutched the precious documents that were tucked inside her shirt, and lowered herself into the abyss. Her fate now tied to a single length of rope, and to the two men descending with her into the belly of the beast. The descent was terrifying. The shaft was pitch black, the rock scraping against her clothes, her hands burning from their grip on the rope. Below, she could see the faint swing of Ethan's lantern. After what felt like an eternity, her feet touched solid ground. They were in a narrow tunnel, the air thick with the smell of damp earth and something metallic. Gunpowder. From the main tunnels they could hear the distant echoing sounds of a firefight. Gus and the sheriff had started the diversion. Ethan held a finger to his lips, pointing down the tunnel. They crept forward, their pistols drawn. The tunnel opened into a larger chamber, the main shaft of the mine. They were on a high ledge, looking down into a cavernous space lit by lanterns. Below them, maybe 30 feet down, was a scene from a nightmare. Silas Blackwood stood in the center of the chamber, surrounded by his men, all of them firing their rifles toward the mine entrance. In the corner, tied to a support beam, was a bruised and bloodied Jed. But there was something else. In the center of the chamber, stacked high, were dozens and dozens of wooden crates. They were stenciled with the name of a mining company, but Clara saw something else. A small, almost invisible symbol on the side of each crate. The official seal of the United States Army. Those crates weren't full of silver ore. They were full of dynamite, stolen Army dynamite. Blackwood wasn't just planning to kill them. He was planning to blow the entire mine, sealing the evidence of the gold, and anyone who knew about it, under thousands of tons of rock. "He's going to destroy everything," Ethan whispered, his face a pale mask of horror. "We have to stop him." But they were hopelessly outgunned. They were on an exposed ledge, 3 people against a dozen killers. Just then, one of Blackwood's men happened to look up. His eyes widened, and he raised his rifle, shouting a warning. The game was up. Blackwood spun around, a look of pure fury on his face when he saw them. "Montgomery!" he roared. "I should have known you were too stubborn to die!" He raised his own pistol, aiming it not at Ethan, but at Clara. In that split second, as Blackwood's finger tightened on the trigger, Billy did the last thing anyone expected. He screamed, a wild, defiant cry, and leaped from the ledge. He didn't jump toward Blackwood or his men. He jumped toward a large ore cart that was perched precariously on a set of tracks near the dynamite. He crashed into it with all his weight. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, with a loud groan, the cart's brake gave way. It began to roll, slowly at first, then faster and faster, heading directly for the massive stack of explosives. It was a suicide mission, a final desperate act of redemption. "No!" Ethan screamed, but it was too late. The cart slammed into the crates of dynamite. The world erupted in a blinding flash of white light and a deafening roar. The force of the explosion threw Clara and Ethan back against the rock wall. The ledge they were standing on crumbled beneath them, and they fell into the chaos below, the world dissolving into fire, smoke, and screaming. When Clara came to, the world was a haze of smoke and ringing ears. The mine was collapsing, dust and rock raining down from the ceiling. She pushed a piece of timber off her legs, her body a symphony of pain. A few feet away, Ethan was stirring, shaking his head to clear it. Most of Blackwood's men were gone, either killed in the blast or buried under the rockfall. But Blackwood himself was still alive. He was staggering to his feet, a bloody gash on his forehead, his face a mask of primal hatred, and his pistol was still in his hand. He raised it, his arm shaking, and aimed it straight at Ethan. But before he could fire, another figure emerged from the smoke. It was Jed. The explosion had snapped the ropes that held him. He was limping, bleeding, but he was free. He saw Blackwood aiming at Ethan, and in that moment, he made a choice. With a final, desperate cry, he lunged at Blackwood, throwing his body in front of his old boss, taking the bullet that was meant for Ethan. Jed collapsed to the ground, his life of betrayal ending in a single selfless act. That one moment of distraction was all Ethan needed. He launched himself at Blackwood, and the 2 men crashed to the ground, locked in a brutal final battle. They rolled in the dust, trading blows, 2 men fighting for the future of the valley. Clara scrambled to her feet, looking for a weapon, anything. Her eyes fell on a discarded pickaxe. She grabbed it, its weight unfamiliar in her hands. She saw her chance. Blackwood was on top of Ethan, his hands around Ethan's throat. She raised the pickaxe, ready to bring it down, but Ethan's voice stopped her. "No!" he choked out, his face turning purple. We do this by the law. He managed to get a hand free and slammed his fist into Blackwood's temple. The Baron grunted, his grip loosening for a fraction of a second. It was enough. Ethan twisted, reversing their positions. He slammed Blackwood's head against the rocky ground. Once, twice. Blackwood went limp. It was over. As the dust settled, they heard a faint groan. It was Billy. He was alive, miraculously shielded from the worst of the blast by the ore cart. His leg was broken, but he was alive. They had won. They had survived. As Ethan tied up the unconscious Blackwood, Clara knelt beside the dying Jed. "Why?" she whispered. Jed coughed, a trickle of blood running from his lips. "He promised me a piece of it all," he rasped. "But I never wanted anyone to get hurt. I just wanted to be someone." His eyes found Ethan's. "The ranch. It was a good home. I'm sorry." And then he was gone. They emerged from the smoke-filled mine into the bright Wyoming sunlight, a strange and battered procession. Ethan and Clara supported the injured Billy between them. Behind them, Gus and Sheriff Miller led a dazed and shackled Silas Blackwood. They had done the impossible. They had faced a monster and won. The trial of Silas Blackwood was the talk of the territory. With the documents Clara had saved and the testimony of Sheriff Miller, the railroad baron's empire of corruption came crashing down. His conviction was swift and certain. He would spend the rest of his life in a federal prison. Daniel Morgan, his ranch now free from debt, returned to his wife a changed man, forever grateful. The Apache Treaty was honored, their sacred lands protected by federal law, a new era of respect dawning between the two cultures. The bodies of Emily, Sarah, and Rebecca were given a proper burial, their stories finally told, their memories finally honored. With a loan secured by the promise of the gold in the mountains, Ethan began to rebuild Dusty Creek Ranch, bigger and better than before. The cowboys who had stood by him were made foremen, their loyalty rewarded. Young Billy, after his leg healed, was given a permanent place at the ranch, his past mistakes washed away by his final act of bravery. Clara Dawson never stopped writing. Her articles in the Cheyenne paper made her a celebrated voice for justice in the West. But her home was at the ranch, by Ethan's side. They were married the following spring, under the wide-open Wyoming sky, on the land they had fought and bled for. Their story became a legend, a testament to the fact that courage isn't about the absence of fear, but about standing up in spite of it. It was a story of how a quiet cook and a silent cowboy, two people running from their pasts, found not only justice, but a future in the heart of the unforgiving frontier. They proved that a home isn't just a place you live. It's something you build, something you defend, and something you earn together. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like and subscribe for more tales of justice from the wild and mysterious West.